Hello and welcome to another InDesign Illustrator tutorial. This one is on making rectangular patterns. This follows on from the last video, which was about making polar patterns, so based on circles, concentric circles, and so on. This time these are linear patterns, so these are based on squares, triangles, and other shapes, and then arrayed in horizontal or vertical, or sometimes both arrangements of these. Some are simple shapes, they're just squares or rectangles with a little skew, mirrored, reflected, overlaying each other, overlapping. Same here, just using the pen tool to edit a square box, to remove one of the corner anchor points, to turn this into a triangle, reflecting it, and then making a diamond shape for on top. Looking at transparency and translucency, opacity, overlaying shapes to make some intricate patterns. Looking at relationships of shapes in themselves, so subdividing a shape up and using the proportions of the shape to give the sizing for the next segments for these, so using golden ratio and so on. Looking at fancy corners inside of InDesign, it has some extra options that Illustrator doesn't have, and then just again very simple arrays of boxes and shapes to make some patterns. No real limit to where you can go in this. Pattern making is quite exciting. You can do a lot of really great intricate geometric shapes. Patterns don't always have to repeat. They could simply be some overlapping strokes and overlaying lines, and then maybe something like using the offset tool to make some patterns and so on. There's a huge array of different tools for you to use to make these. Some of these will be much better to make inside of InDesign. Others will be easier and better to make inside of Illustrator. I gotta go through a little breakdown of making some of these shapes in both Illustrator and InDesign. Gotta start off in Illustrator, just because some of these will be more familiar terms for you to use and familiar tools. So most of the patterns are based on some basic geometric shapes and then doing an array of these. So using maybe the copy and paste, so just using the Alt key, Option key on a Mac to copy, and then once you've copied it, you can use the Control D or Command D to replicate it. So very, very simple. So use the Alt Option key to copy. It will look for overlaps or intersections or reference points from where you're moving it to, and then it's just Control D or Command D. Now, if you give this already some nice colors or patterns or fills, then you're already off to a kind of a good start in what you can do with these. So for example, again, just pick it up and then copy it, and then I can repeat that. Now, if I give these a translucency or a transparency, so I reduce that opacity to less than 100%, I'm going to see really nice colors and patterns as these overlay on top of each other. So you can see you can make some fairly interesting patterns, or what I would consider interesting, fairly quickly. Circles, also a really great shape to work with. Just again, use the Alt or Option key to copy it. You can have these overlap and intersect with each other, and then you can kind of figure out where your pattern might go from there. And it could be something as simple again as just having some mouse problems. I think I need to replace my mouse, and just copy these, or maybe change the fill color on these. So I go for a yellow and no stroke, and you can see there's a possibility of having that repeated. Select these, hold the Alt or Option and drag them down, and then maybe give these a different color fill. So just swap that around, and you could take all of those, so select over them all, and then again use the Alt or Option key, and then start to copy and repeat those, and getting some very interesting shapes and forms. Now, at the moment, these are all individual objects. So when I'm maybe doing these, it might be an idea when I'm right back at the start of these to turn these into groups. Or if I'm not interested in the overlap in these, use the Pathfinder and unify these so that you have fewer Illustrator has fewer shapes to consider and think about. And I'm just going to bring the fill color into the foreground and change that. And again, I could think about changing the opacity down on these. And if I went right down on these, maybe around about 20%, when I copy these, then I'm going to get stacked colors on top. And you get a very, very subtle look to this kind of work. Another way of thinking about these and rectangular patterns, so patterns that repeat in a row, either in a single row or multiple rows, would be the different shape patterns that you have available to make these. So if I just use a square and copy that, copy it a few times, and then do the same in the other direction, so hold down Alt and copy it, I get a grid-like structure to these. Now, I could change that into something like a stagger step, where you have something like on a stagger step in a brick system, so I could have it halfway in between or directly on top of each other. Other shapes that you can make these kind of patterns with, triangles are very good, so I can move this from corner to corner, and likewise I can copy that and either reflect it, so I could have it going this direction, or using the transform and flip it vertically, so I could have it that way to make kind of diamond-like shapes, or moving that exactly in between these, and then having zigzags and other kind of stagger steps to these. Other shapes that work well for these would be hexagons. So with a hexagon, you'd be used to seeing these in honeycombs and beehive kind of objects. So I would just take it, select it using the select tool, hold down Alt, and I can pick up the anchor on the opposite corner and then copy that over to match this one. And it will highlight to say that you have these in position. So those smart guides are helping you to align up your pattern. Likewise, if I pick up these two, I can use the Alt Option key and pick it up on this anchor and line that up with this one here and start to form a really intricate pattern from these. Now, I probably wouldn't copy them all at one time. I would probably take one, and if I was thinking about maybe making some pattern work to this or drawing some shapes and so on, I would make one swatch version or one piece of that pattern, make it into a group, and then copy that around to make the rest of the pattern. You also have octagons, which kind of stack very well together, so you could just copy those together. You can of course use the align tool for making some of these, so if you are thinking about just aligning them up with each other, and then you can align to the selection or key object and reduce the spacing to 0 and just get them to fill in for you. You could stack these in a number of ways, one being just edge to edge. Another way would be going from octagonal gaps around these, and if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you might consider having a look at Cairo tiling. It's named after the city and its ways of stacking tiles and patterns in very intricate and elaborate ways where they nest inside each other. So just line this one up carefully, and then I could take two of those and Alt Option and copy it, and then start to have patterns stacking up this way where I have a smaller little gap section in between. But just like with making the polar array, guides and grids are very helpful for you to do this. So you could of course just turn on your rulers and bring down some ruler guides from the edge to make your first swatch if you were thinking about making it a particular size, so maybe 100 mil by 100 mil or so on. You could draw that shape up and then use that to form your pattern. Illustrator has another really great guide making tool, and that is the rectangular grid tool, this one here, and this will if you click on it and click on your space somewhere on your artboard, it's going to ask you how you're going to draw this, how big. So it could be 100 mil by 100 mil. So we make a small little sample section, and then the number of horizontal dividers and the number of vertical dividers. Okay, so if we made this 2 dividers with 2 dividers, will give us 9 boxes, like so. Now, there is, just like in making the polar grid, there are some options that you can use when you're free drawing this. So if I click into the tool, click and drag onto my artboard, and if my mouse cooperates, so while it's active and I'm holding down on it, I can use the up and down keys to add in more rows, or the right and left keys to add or subtract more columns. Now, there is a really cool way of changing the values from these and skewing it. So if I use the X key, it will skew those columns to the left, and if I use the C key, it will skew those to the right, and they have percentage changes to each other. So at the moment there's 0, 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, and so on. And you can use this to work out hierarchy, scale, and proportion for your shapes. And likewise, you can do it vertically using the F and V. So you can bring these down. So F will bring it down, and V will bring it back up. And you can use these then to make a very interesting pattern grid for you to work with. So if you were thinking about golden ratio and golden section, you could make yourself a very intricate pattern like this. Okay, you can of course just use the regular grid with no skewing. If you do that, just click on the polar grid tool, click onto your space, your workspace, single click, and then you can see how the skewing was applied to this. So you could change this back to 0, 0, leave the number of dividers that you're looking for. So if you were thinking about it in quarters, you add in 3 dividers rather than 2, and that will give you a very small box. In this case, I didn't check my measurements there, but this is the box itself, and I can use this to divide up my space. So if you think about how you might take just an object, maybe something like this, a triangle, and then you're applying that as a grid for choosing where these are going to repeat. So you have to kind of imagine then, if I'm going to put these into each of these boxes, what it would look like. I can pick this up and pick it up from a corner and copy it into the next box, and so on, and it will, the smart guides will kick in and start to apply the spacing and so on. So you can just copy and repeat. Use the shift key and pick up all 3 copies, grab the alt key and drag it down, and then it's going to start to look at your spacing in between these, and then again you can just press Ctrl D to repeat these. The idea of using the grid in behind is just for you to work out where you're going to place your objects. It's not that this is going to become part of it. In actual fact, you'll probably use a separate layer for these. So you would make this and then make another layer, drag it below, call it something like background, and then you can move this onto that layer. So select the background layer, the layer below, and then right click and arrange and send to current layer, and that will change the highlight color. You can see when it's selected, it's highlighting red because this layer is red. This one will highlight blue because it's on the blue layer, and then you can lock that so you can't interact with it. You can't select this object, but you can turn this on and off so that you can use it as a reference point. Another way of thinking about this would be, just move down to the next one. You want to make a little arrangement of some shapes, and you want these to be relative to each other in what size you are making these. So you could make these as is, or you could look at, say, the size of this one. Let's just take a copy of this. And these were just randomly drawn rectangles, and then just scale down using the corner toggles and holding shift. But maybe I want to make these a lot more related to each other, so, or relative to each other. What I could do is say make this one 25 mil, just so it's a round number for what we're doing. I could use the polar grid tool, and I'm just going to draw a box, and that is going to be 25 mil. So I'm just going to reduce that down to 2 and this one to 2 and make it 25 by 25 mil. Oh, and turn the skew back to 0 as well while I'm at it. And that will give me this shape. Now, at the moment, this has no fill, so I'm just going to turn that into a white fill, or sorry, black stroke, white fill, and then get rid of the fill so I can see this. Because this is not a guide in the sense of one of these ruler guides, this can have a stroke weight, so I'm just going to reduce that down to hairline, so 0.25, and then I can use this with my object. So at the moment this has no transparency, but my line work is on top of this. Okay, so just in case you're wondering how you can see that through it. And I'm just going to line them up on top of each other. And what I can do with this is now I can work out proportions from scaling one to another if I'm thinking about a golden ratio in relation to this. And it might be something as simple as just copying this down to here, and then using the shift key and scaling this down, and then reducing that down to somewhere around here where they intersect with each other, the two patterns. And you can use that then to start to stack and repeat what you're doing with the pattern, so everything is in relation to its own size and proportions. And that's how some of the patterns that I showed you earlier in InDesign were constructed. And then it's really kind of up to yourself as to where you're starting with the pattern and so on. So you have this way of making patterns, and then some of you are probably thinking, well, we already covered making patterns. Those were slightly different. That was using the pattern making tool inside of Illustrator, and that was using the making new pattern swatches. So it's slightly different, but I'm just going to cover that too, just in case you haven't done that. And that is where you're drawing just those same box-like shapes or pattern shapes or samples of your pattern, and then you're going up to object, pattern, and making that. That will give you this warning dialog box saying the new pattern has been added to the swatch pattern. Choose OK, and then it immediately takes you into the pattern making area where you are constructing the pattern. And just in the same way I was talking about different grid systems where you're manually making one, these have the same option. So a square grid, and then brick by brick, half, so stagger step, third, quarter, all the kind of fractional increments, whether it's by row or by column, and then hexagonal patterns as well. So using a hexagonal pattern. And then if I use grid, these are now stacked edge to edge. And then I can choose using the pattern gap tool. So the tile spacing, I can choose whether they overlap with each other. So if I reduce this down to here, I'm going to get very interesting overlaps between the translucency and transparency between these. When you're happy with your pattern, you hit done, and this will bring you out and look like nothing has happened. And what has happened is you have made this new swatch that has been added to your swatch panel. So if I take this one, at the moment it has the last swatch that was created, and now I can fill this with the one that I've just created. Okay, so that's how you can make them inside of Illustrator. You can make them by drawing some shapes and overlapping them. The pattern making, this kind of pattern making using the swatch fill, this is something that's more used for fabric making, textile surface design and fabric design in that way. These are for vector shapes for books and illustrations and so on. And then inside of InDesign, you have a very similar interface for making these, way of making them. So many of the tools that you have used in Illustrator will be the same ones that you would use inside of InDesign. So if you were looking to change the square and turn it into, say, a triangle, just like you would in Illustrator, you can select this, pre-select it, and then use the pen tool and remove some anchor points to turn it into a triangle. And you can select that object. You have the same options for stroke, and just bring out your swatches, F5, and then you can make some other transformations to this object. So if you were thinking about reflecting it, you can hold down the Alt key and then you can reflect it, and then that will make you a copy. So I have two triangles that are the same color. Let's change one of those to a slightly different color, and then I can use these to make a grid of boxes. So I can pick this up, hold down the Alt key, and then line those up with each other. Now I could do other things to this. So again, this is where your imagination of what you're doing with your pattern. It could be that I would reflect this around. I could take a copy of all of that and bring it down. And then reflect that back. Start to make diamond and chevron. Some of these lines, they look like they're there, but these are kind of visual glitches inside of InDesign. And oopsie daisy, it doesn't have the same click and hold to drag and zoom or zoom out inside of InDesign. It's still the click, and because my mouse is not functioning, it's giving me 3 or 4 clicks, and that's why I'm zooming in to very extreme close. You have transparency and translucency just like in Illustrator. So these ones here, you can change those values to bring up and down the transparency of your objects. You can of course just realign these up with each other, and this time inside of InDesign the command is Control-Alt-4 or Command-Option-4 to step and repeat your pattern. So when you make a move or a copy, so say for example I just copy this over here and copy it right next to it, I can press Control-Alt-4 on a PC, Command-Option-4, and that will step and repeat that task, that transformation, and you can make some really wonderful patterns doing that. You can just, again, these are 2 triangles overlapped with 2 other triangles with just a slight difference in translucency and transparency. These are 2 rows of triangles just grouped together. So I'll just ungroup that. And then you can see exactly what they are. So you could bring these together. You could use rule of thirds, golden ratio, figure out where's the best placement for overlapping these. You could do them individually or as a group. It's really up to your own investigations of making patterns and so on. This one's interesting because this is using the corners to make these. So inside of InDesign you have, or sorry, inside of Illustrator first, you had seen that you can make corners and turn them into beveled and chamfered corners and rounded corners, so a fillet on those. And inside of InDesign you still have those options, but you've got a few more. I'm just going to give this a, actually no, I'll keep the fill on it and the stroke on it. So when you have the blocks that you've made, whether it's through the frame tool or the shape tool, you have options for the corners here. So inside of Illustrator you had 3 options. You had the rounded, inverted rounded, and a bevel. Now you have a few different options that you can choose. Inset, fancy. And then this is the distance that they protrude away from the actual corner. So this is the radius from here to here. And you can make some really interesting shapes with these, especially with the polygons, because they have unusual numbers of corners. You can make kind of snowflake shapes fairly easy. Just swap this over to a fancy corner, and then you'll see you get really unusual designs for these. Now they only will obviously go in whatever the radius is for that edge, but you can really play around with those and do some very interesting kind of overlapping shapes with these, especially because you have the object properties for these. So you bring out the transform tools and you could change the angle, the shearing, so on. You can flip them around and rotate them and transform them in that way. And even just when you start to draw these, so if I use the polygon tool and draw a triangle, so use the up and down keys to change the number of sides on these. You can add in rows and columns of these using the arrow keys as well, and then you can kind of change them completely around and have a look at what a grid of these little shapes start to look like. You get very unusual shapes fairly quickly. So that's using the corner tools. So when you select this, it'll be up here in the properties, corners, and you can bring these out and change them individually, or if they're chain linked together, you're going to change them all at one time. And then next sheet, I've got some very simple examples of a square with some opacity on it, and then it's not matching exactly, it's kind of small gap, big gap, small gap, but all it is two squares that are overlapped, and then using the distance between here and here to make these. So you can pick this up, hold down the Alt Option key and Shift to keep it at a 45-degree angle, and then line them up with each other. And then again, it's Control Alt 4 or Command Option 4 on a Mac to step and repeat those, so you can start to make up those very long rows of pattern and shape. And then this one, again, it's like the first example, except it's not a square. So it's just making these into rectangular forms, taking away one of the corner anchor points and then turning it into a triangle. And then once you have those, you can use Control G or Command G, turn it into a group, and then use Option while dragging it to make some copies. And that way you can start to stack these up into a pattern, and you could copy them vertically. You could invert them or flip them around, or flip every second one around, and then start to have very unusual patterns between these. So you could either have them turning into diamonds or zigzags or chevrons. You can do a huge range of things to these. You can group it further, so you have just one item. Same in Illustrator, or gets you the rotate tool. It will always be about the center of the object. So if you don't want to rotate it about the center and about a corner, click on the corner, click and drag, and then you can start to rotate it. And maybe you want to turn the pattern on its side and work with it at a slightly different angle, or turn one of these into the vertical for you to change where your eye is perceiving this. This one, it's just some triangles stacked up. So you've seen back on this page, just flick down to that. So it's just some triangles stacked up, 3 of them, and then mirrored, 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 and that gives you a really interesting pattern. Again, just using transparency, but you could do the same thing with some strokes. So you could pick these up and then instead of having no outline stroke to them, you could swap these around and work with the stroke instead and make some interesting patterns in that way. So you could have very geometric patterns using different line weights, so you could increase the stroke size. So working in kind of proportions from that, so it could be 2 and 1, and then how they might mirror on top of each other. And again, another thing to think about is where the alignment for that stroke is, so whether it's the center, the inside, or the outside. So if you're dealing with some patterns, you might want to reconsider where you're placing that alignment. So you could pop that towards the inside, and then you could start to flip these around just using the transform and flip horizontal or vertical and doing something like that. Other ways of thinking about the pattern, and this might make a little bit more sense of what I was talking about inside of Illustrator when I'm talking about these kind of grids. You're just using this as a guide for creating the pattern. So here, this is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 by 3 repeats of this pattern, and it's all based on that box-like form. So you can just make these and copy them from edge to edge and start to stack them up with each other. And then this one is just a couple of dots. You might consider putting a colored background, so a large colored object or shape in the background, and then making your pattern on top of it. So I hope that gives you some really interesting things to think about in terms of rectangular pattern making using maybe transparency, translucency, overlapping shapes, the corner systems that you would be thinking about. And again, here are some where they are just rotated at a slightly different angle, overlapping in relation to its own size and shape. Thank you.